The Gospel according to John, chapter 18, verses 10 to 18. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him, and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews, that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them, and warmed himself. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In this second reading from chapter 18 of John, we continue to witness the arrest and the beginning of the trial of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In yesterday's reading from chapter 18, we were witness to the band of soldiers, Roman soldiers from the garrison in Jerusalem, accompanied by officers of the Sanhedrin, confronting Jesus and his disciples. Judas Iscariot was at the head of that group, and we were witness to Jesus speaking the words, I am, and that causing tremendous fear amongst the soldiers and officers, such that they fell backwards and were almost paralyzed with fear. But Jesus essentially reassured them with the same words. And the penultimate verse of yesterday's reading was, Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, protecting his disciples there from arrest and possible execution. Now in today's reading we continue, and this is very much in parallel with the narrative in the Synoptic Gospels. Sometimes we have a little bit more detail, sometimes we have a little less from the Gospel of John compared to the Synoptics. Here we see that it was Simon Peter who struck the high priest's servant. In the other Gospels we just hear of it as a disciple having a sword did this act. And one theory for why John is naming that disciple, that courageous disciple, as Simon Peter, is by the time that John's writing his Gospel, Peter has been dead quite some years, and there's no risk now of retribution, whereas, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, written around 50 AD, perhaps there was a fear of relatives of that servant seeking retribution against Peter. In any case, Simon Peter it is, the impetuous lead disciple, bravely, courageously striking out against this far more well-armed and overwhelming military force, but perhaps emboldened by seeing the fear in that group from the divine presence of Christ. And we learn that the unfortunate servant of the high priest who lost his right ear, had the name Malchus. One interesting note is that in the original Greek, Simon Peter's name is written slightly differently to literally read Simon the Rock. Remember, Peter in our English from Petros, and that having come from Cephas, Christ naming Simon after rock. And John, in this verse of action and courage, describing Simon not as Simon Rock, as it were, but Simon the Rock, emphasizing his second name. But this is not the right action, because Jesus is delivering himself to his persecutors to fulfill his commandment to the Father and to end his ministry with his own sacrifice. And he says to Peter, "Put thy sword into thy sheath." And then a very interesting line which has an echo of the agony that is described in the other Gospels in Gethsemane, which would be only minutes before this piece of the narrative, but is missed in John. But an echo of that here: "The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it?" And just to remind us all of that agony in Gethsemane, if we, for example, turn to the Gospel of Matthew, and we recall that Jesus went about a stone's throw beyond his inner core of disciples and fell to the ground and prayed. And in verse 39 of chapter 26 of Matthew, we have, "And he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." And again a little later in verse 42, "He went away again the second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done." So very much a strong echo here in this line in John. Not the agony of Gethsemane per se, but an echo, bringing closer harmony between the narratives of John and the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we learn that the Roman soldiers, the band with their captain, and then alongside them the Sanhedrin officers, lay hands on Jesus and bind him with, presumably with a rope, that he is their prisoner now. And it's not described here, but as we learn from the other Gospels, the disciples flee. The sheep are scattered, as Jesus said would be the case. And Jesus is led to the palace of the high priest. It's thought that Annas and Caiaphas may have met with Jesus separately, but in the same place, in that palace of the high priest. Prior to the unrest and the Roman rule tightening up in Jerusalem, high priest would have that role until they died, but this had started to become almost a revolving door, with a number of high priests in living memory in Jerusalem. It was possibly even becoming somewhat of a sinecure. In any case, Annas, who's quite powerful, possibly the head of the Sanhedrin, had been the high priest. This had passed on to his sons, and now was actually in the hands of his son-in-law, Caiaphas. But Jesus is first taken to Annas, perhaps because he is still extremely influential and senior. Another idea is it would take time for Caiaphas to assemble enough of the Sanhedrin to actually hold a sort of mock trial in the palace. So in the meantime, Annas is meeting with Jesus. And John reminds us here that indeed that high priest Caiaphas was he which gave the council to the other members of the Sanhedrin that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. We remember that way back in chapter 11, and this would be in verse 50. The belief in Jesus was growing through his very commanding presence and teaching in Jerusalem, and the Jewish elite had determined that he should be destroyed. And in verse 49 and 50 we have the following: "And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not." And after that, in chapter 11, John had pointed out that even though he spoke in a very worldly way, he was actually essentially fulfilling prophecy, essentially, that the Messiah should be sacrificed for not just the Jewish nation, but for all nations. And then the rest of today's reading essentially concerns the tragic series of denials of Simon Peter. This is the first denial that we'll read of today, and we'll see the others tomorrow. Again, in harmony with the Synoptic Gospels, we learn of Simon Peter following at some distance the armed guard. He would be very frightened, and rightly so. He was close to losing his life in striking out against the servant of the high priest, and if it were not for Jesus' presence, no doubt he would have been put to the sword for that act. So he must be terrified. He's following at a distance. And here's the enigmatic part of the John narrative, is that we learn that there is another disciple, and this disciple's actually known unto the high priest and has easy access to the palace. Now, it is a common assumption in most commentaries that this is John the Apostle, because John never mentions himself by name in his gospel, nor his brother James, and we have seen already that he essentially describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. We saw that language at the Last Supper. So the easy assumption here is that this is actually John the Apostle who is accompanying Peter. And there's logic to that too, because they are two of the three inner core, James, John, and Peter, the three that witnessed the Transfiguration, in the Synoptic Gospels witnessed the agony of Christ in Gethsemane, and so on. So they're often together. On the other hand, what speaks against this other disciple being John are a couple of things. First of all, he's not described as the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is the common description in this gospel for, we believe, John the Apostle. He's just described as another disciple. So a different use of modifier there to describe this disciple. And also there is just the simple question, how would this Galilean fisherman, who is known to be very, very close to Christ, who is a figure that the Jewish elite detest, how could that person possibly be known and trusted by the high priest and have easy access to the home of the high priest? It doesn't really add up. So commentators tend to say it's probably John, but I think I'm more aligned with other commentators who actually make these points and say perhaps it is a follower of Christ who is a person of some influence in Jerusalem. Perhaps, for example, the owner of the house in which the Last Supper was held, and this person would naturally have the ear of the high priest, and it may not be known that this person is indeed a disciple of Christ. So not one of the 11 apostles, but a devout follower of Christ residing in Jerusalem and a person of some influence. And this, to be honest, makes much more sense. And that might be why there is no real characterization of that person. Because it's, from the point of view of the narrative, not actually that important to say who exactly it was. Other commentators think it could be James, because John the Apostle, as author of this gospel, never mentions his brother either. Such is the degree of self-effacement of the author. There's even the idea that it could be Judas Iscariot, who would have easy access to the palace because he's a traitor. So I've just seen that mentioned by one commentator. It's dismissed by all other commentators. It's an interesting idea, though. Almost certainly not Judas Iscariot, though, because I think John would indicate that in some manner and not just describe that particular person as another disciple. However, bringing up the name of Judas Iscariot does raise the question of where is Judas Iscariot in this part of the narrative, and it's something that had never really occurred to me before in reading the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. I've not seen it really brought up, to be honest, in commentaries either. But as we know from the Synoptic Gospels, and we'll see this later on in this chapter, one of the reasons that Simon Peter arouses suspicion in the palace is because of his strong Galilean accent. And Judas Iscariot, of course, knows Simon Peter extraordinarily well. And it doesn't seem unlikely that Judas Iscariot would be in the palace as a witness and would see Peter there and could denounce him. So, curious questions about the role of Judas Iscariot after the actual arrest, and was Judas in the palace during the trial of Jesus? It might be that within the Jewish law he can't be used as a witness because he had taken payment from the Sanhedrin to bring Jesus to the trial, as it were. And although we see this as a mock trial and great evil behind the trial, there is still strong legal constraints on the way the trial is conducted. They do have to find witnesses, for example, and they have trouble finding reliable witnesses. And it may be that it's simply not possible for them to use Judas Iscariot as a witness because he has compromised himself, and they have compromised him as a witness by paying him to deliver Jesus to them. So these are just thoughts that have occurred to me, and they're really almost more in the form of questions. The role of Judas Iscariot in this part of the narrative. In any case, there is some follower of Jesus who has entered the palace of the high priest. But Peter, afraid and humble as a Galilean fisherman, and yet suffering from heartbreak at the arrest of the Lord, could not but follow, and he is standing outside the palace. But he is let in by the other disciple. Again, they're described in verse 16 as that other disciple. That person speaks to the maidservant that keeps the door, attends to the door, the receptionist in modern language, and Peter is brought in. But that young woman says to Peter, "Are you not also one of this man's disciples?" Interesting language again here, because perhaps she knows that the other disciple, and let's assume actually that is, for example, a high-ranking person within Jerusalem, maybe she knows that person is a follower of Christ, and therefore the use of the word also here. And maybe it's not even an accusation, she's just curious. In the Synoptic Gospels, there's more malevolence behind that question, because there is not the role of that other disciple narrated in the Synoptic Gospels, Peter simply gains access to the palace and is confronted by maidservants. In any case, here is the first denial of Peter. He's frightened. He's probably extremely uncomfortable being in the palace of the high priest, given his humble origins. He's overawed, overwhelmed, and probably without thinking, he denies Christ. He denies Christ. He says, I am not. And to finish off today's reading, we learn of, in the courtyard of the palace, there are servants and officers of the Sanhedrin. They've made a fire of coals. It's cold. It's April, and at night would be cold, and they're warming themselves. And Peter, probably anxious not to look too obvious by standing alone, joins the group and warms himself. And this, I think, is quite a striking piece of narrative, because Peter is now standing with the opposition, just as Judas stood with them during the arrest, and he's warming himself. He's denied following Christ. He's warming himself. Jesus will be cold and alone.